We build everything here from Superbirds, original stuff, and then we got one section of our business up here.
There is a small town in North Carolina called Level Cross that most Americans have never heard of, and yet inside a modest garage there, sitting quietly behind a family home, is a collection so valuable and so personal that its own owner has spent decades refusing to sell most of it, even when he needed the money. This is the story of what is actually inside that garage, why one of the most famous athletes in American history chose to keep it hidden from the world for so long, and what finally changed. Stick around because the truth here is stranger, sadder, and more human than any rumor you've heard. To understand why any of this matters, you first have to understand who Richard Petty actually is, because the scale of his career is almost hard to believe if you did not grow up watching it happen. Between 1958 and 1992, Richard Petty won 200 NASCAR Cup Series races. 200. No driver in the history of the sport has come close to that number since. He won 7 NASCAR championships, a record that has only ever been matched, never beaten. He won the Daytona 500, the sport's biggest race, 7 times. He set the record for the most wins in a single season with 27 victories in 1967 alone, and during that same stretch he won 10 races in a row, a streak that still stands untouched. Over a career that spanned 35 years and more than 1,100 starts, he became known simply as the King, and that nickname has followed him for half a century because nobody has ever given anyone a real reason to take it back. But Richard Petty did not become the king by himself, and that is where the story of Level Cross really begins. His father, Lee Petty, was one of the founding fathers of NASCAR itself, a 3-time champion who won the very first Daytona 500 in 1959. Lee started the family racing operation Petty Enterprises in Level Cross in 1949, working out of what was essentially a shed behind the family home. Richard's brother, Maurice, became the engine builder behind most of those 200 wins, a man who understood horsepower the way other people understand simple arithmetic. Their cousin, Dale Inman, served as Richard's crew chief for the majority of his career, calling the strategic shots from the pit box while Richard made the split-second decisions behind the wheel. For members of one family from one small town, all inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. That is not just a racing dynasty. That is one of the great multi-generational stories in the history of American sport, and almost all of it happened inside or right next to that same modest garage in Level Cross. Part of what made Richard Petty so recognizable and so beloved was never just the winning. It was the way he carried himself while doing it. When Petty prepared his very first race car back in 1958, he mixed a gallon of white paint with a gallon of blue, and that simple, almost accidental decision produced the shade the world now knows as Petty Blue, a color that would define his cars for the rest of his career. In 1972, Petty was approached by an oil additive company called STP, whose president reportedly offered him $250,000 to repaint his entire car in the company's signature Dayglow red. Petty has said publicly that he almost turned the money down purely because he did not want to give up the blue that had become his identity. The two sides eventually compromised, splitting the car into the now iconic red and blue scheme that fans instantly associate with the number 43. That partnership between Petty and STP went on to become the longest continuous sponsorship relationship in NASCAR history, lasting more than 50 years, built on nothing more complicated than a driver who refused to fully let go of the color he had mixed by hand in a small-town garage. That kind of loyalty went both directions, which is a large part of why Petty became not just the winningest driver in NASCAR history, but also, by a wide margin, one of its most beloved. Between 1962 and 1978, fans voted him NASCAR's most popular driver 9 separate times, a fan-decided honor that has nothing to do with lap times and everything to do with how a driver treats the people who show up to watch him race. Petty became known for staying at the track long after a race ended, signing autograph after autograph until the line was gone, no matter how the day had gone for him behind the wheel. His fans loved him enough that Petty for President bumper stickers became a genuine cultural fixture through the 1970s and 1980s, decades before anyone was using that kind of language ironically. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment because it explains something important about the man who eventually built a private garage full of memories rather than a museum full of price tags. Petty's entire public identity was built on generosity towards strangers. The things he chose to keep instead of sell were never about keeping people out. They were about keeping certain things close. Richard Petty has said in interviews given over the years that during his actual racing career he never thought much about preserving old cars. In the 1960s and 1970s, a used race car was simply a used race car. Teams were constantly strapped for money, and building the next car mattered far more than saving the last one. Old cars got sold off to smaller teams. They got stripped for usable parts. Some were simply left to sit. Nobody at the time imagined that a beat-up stock car from a Saturday night short track would someday be worth a small fortune to collectors. Petty himself has admitted this plainly. Nobody thought about saving them, he has said, so for a long time they didn't. It is one of the more honest things a legend of his stature has ever said publicly, and it explains a great deal about what happened and did not happen to the physical relics of his career. What did survive, though, tells its own remarkable story. The Richard Petty Museum, which Richard's late wife Linda established in 1988, sits today back in Level Cross after a stretch of years in nearby Randleman, and it houses an extraordinary collection that spans 4 generations of the family. Lee, Richard, Kyle, and Adam Petty all have a presence inside its walls. Among the vehicles on display is a genuine Plymouth Superbird, one of the most visually striking race cars ever built. Chrysler's engineers designed the Superbird in 1970 specifically to exploit NASCAR's rules around aerodynamics, giving it a dramatically pointed nose cone and an oversized rear wing, not for style, but because those features reduced drag and increased downforce at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour. Petty drove Plymouth products to 18 wins that season, and the Superbird became permanently woven into the image of his blue and red number 43. Seeing one of these cars in person, especially one connected directly to Petty's own career, is the kind of experience that stops even casual visitors in their tracks. Visitors who have walked through the museum have also described sections dedicated entirely to Lee Petty's early championship years, uniforms and trophies from Richard's own 7 title runs, and even a display connected to Richard's love of firearms and outdoor life, a side of the man that rarely comes up in highlight reels but clearly meant something to him personally. The museum is genuinely worth visiting, and by every account from people who have actually been there, Richard Petty himself still shows up, still wears the cowboy hat and dark sunglasses that became part of his visual identity, and still signs autographs for fans who make the drive to a town of fewer than 4,000 people just to shake his hand. But here is the detail that changes the entire story. Even Richard Petty himself has said on the record that he has more cars, more trophies, and more memorabilia than his own museum can display. In an interview given when he was 80 years old, Petty explained that after accumulating stuff across an 80-year lifetime, he had finally decided it was time to let some of it go. He put pieces of his personal collection up for public auction, including one of his most iconic cars, the 1974 Dodge Charger that carried him to 31 wins that season, along with his 1981 Daytona 500 trophy, championship rings and race-worn uniforms. Petty told reporters plainly that he had accumulated far more than he could ever showcase, and that some of what he was selling had genuinely meant something to him across his career. That single admission tells you almost everything you need to know about what has been sitting quietly out of public view in Level Cross for decades. Not junk, not filler, but pieces of an extraordinary life that simply outgrew the space built to hold them. It also reframes the popular idea that Petty has refused every single offer for every single item connected to his career. The truth is more layered and, frankly, more human than that. Petty has been willing to part with certain things on his own terms and in his own time, when it made sense to him. What he has never been willing to do is treat the compound in Level Cross, the place where his father built that first garage, where his brother tuned engines that won championships, and where his son and grandson grew up learning the family trade, as simply a warehouse of assets waiting for the right buyer. For Petty, the distinction has never really been about secrecy for its own sake. It has been about which things are history for the world to see, and which things are still, in a very real sense, home. That distinction becomes even more important when you understand what the Petty family lost. In May of 2000, Richard's grandson, Adam Petty, was killed during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway when a stuck throttle sent his car into the outside wall at full speed. Adam was 20 years old. He was Kyle Petty's son, and he had already begun competing professionally, making him the first fourth-generation athlete in any major American sport. He was gone before most fans who would eventually have followed his career even knew his name. Kyle Petty has spoken with real candor about how losing his son reshaped everything he understood about what the family's legacy actually meant, and about what was worth protecting versus what was simply worth having. Richard Petty, a man who built his public reputation on being warm, accessible, and endlessly patient with fans, has talked about Adam's death only rarely, and always with the careful economy of someone choosing words because no words are really sufficient. It would be dishonest to suggest that a tragedy like that does not change how a family thinks about its own history, its own keepsakes, and its own privacy. It almost certainly does. The Richard Petty Museum today includes a dedicated space honoring Adam alongside Lee, Richard, and Kyle, a choice that says something important on its own. Rather than shutting his memory away entirely, the family folded it into the same public story as the rest of their history, on terms they were comfortable with, at a pace they controlled. Kyle Petty's own career deserves more attention than it typically gets, if only because it illustrates just how enormous his father's shadow really was. Racing professionally for roughly 2 decades, Kyle won 8 Cup Series races, a total that would represent a genuinely respectable career for almost anyone else on Earth, and yet it was constantly measured against a father who had won 200. Kyle has spoken honestly about what that comparison felt like, growing up as the son of the most statistically dominant driver in the history of the sport. For Kyle, the garage in level cross was never really about history the way it is for outside collectors and reporters. It was where he grew up. The tools on the wall were the same tools he watched his uncle Maurice and his father use when he was a child. The cars were not artifacts of a golden era to him. They were simply the cars being built in the building where he later learned to work on engines himself. That intergenerational thread has not stopped. Richard Petty's grandson, Thad Moffitt, currently competes in NASCAR's Truck Series, carrying the family name into a 5th generation of involvement in the sport his great-great-grandfather helped invent. And the working side of the level cross compound, now known as Petty's Garage after the original Petty Enterprises operation was restructured in 2008 amid the increasingly expensive, increasingly corporate landscape of modern NASCAR, has continued doing serious, hands-on restoration work. In recent years, the shop undertook the recreation of Petty's 1964 Plymouth Belvedere, the car that carried him to his first Daytona 500 win and his first championship. The team tracked down an original period-correct chassis, worked from Richard's own direct memory of how the car was built, and brought Maurice Petty and Dale Inman, both in their 80s, back into the same building where the original car had been constructed 6 decades earlier, doing the same work with the same seriousness they had always brought to it. That finished car has since been displayed at the National Automobile and Truck Museum in Indiana, drawing enthusiastic reactions from visitors of every generation, according to the museum's own staff. It is a strange and moving thing to consider. 3 Hall of Famers, each past his 80th birthday, standing in the same shop where they built a championship car as young men, rebuilding it stroke for stroke, bolt for bolt, simply because the memory of how it was supposed to be done had never actually left any of them. So what is the honest answer to the question this video is built around? What is actually inside Richard Petty's garage? It is not some hidden vault of forbidden secrets locked away purely for mystery's sake. It is something closer to what most of us have somewhere in our own lives, just on a much larger and more historically significant scale. More than 8 decades of accumulated memory, belonging to a family that happened to become the single most successful dynasty in the history of American motorsport. It is a genuine Plymouth Superbird that most collectors would trade almost anything to own. It is tools that Lee Petty hung on hooks in the 1940s, still hanging in roughly the same place. It is a museum's worth of championship trophies and race-worn uniforms, plus, by Petty's own admission, considerably more than the museum can actually hold. It is grief, quietly present in the way the family has chosen to honor Adam Petty's memory on its own terms rather than turn it into a spectacle. And it is pride, the specific, uncomplicated kind that comes from 4, now 5 generations of the same family working in the same buildings on the same small patch of North Carolina land where it all began in 1949. Richard Petty turned 89 in July of 2026. He still lives close to the house where he was born, right next to the museum his late wife built. He still, by every account from people who have actually met him, treats fans with a warmth that seems almost impossible to fake after this many decades of doing it. He is still, remarkably, the same driver who almost said no to $250,000 because he did not want to give up a shade of blue he had mixed himself in a garage as a young man, and that single detail probably tells you more about how he has approached his entire personal collection than any auction catalog ever could. The garage in level cross was never really a secret designed to frustrate collectors or tease documentary crews. It was simply a family's honest answer to an impossible question. What do you do with the physical evidence of an entire life, when that life happens to be the greatest career in the history of your sport? Richard Petty's answer has always been the same. You keep what matters most close to home, you let the world see what you're proud to share, and every so often when the time feels right on your own terms, you let a little more of it go. That is not a mystery built for clickbait. It is just what an honest, deeply rooted family does with an extraordinary inheritance, and honestly, that might be more remarkable than any secret room could ever be. If this look inside the Petty family story added something to how you see NASCAR's greatest dynasty, let us know in the comments what surprised you most, and subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories behind American sports legends.